Okay, so you want to own a cell tower. Picture the postcard version first. A galvanized steel monopole rising from a fenced quarter-acre, antennas bolted near the top for 3 carriers, an equipment shelter humming at the base, and a rent check landing every month without lifting a finger. You picture it as a vending machine for money, planted once and collecting forever. The kind of thing you mention casually at a dinner party, while everyone else checks their phone on the network it carries. Now picture a landowner in rural Ohio, $600 a month on a ground lease signed years ago, and picture the letter that showed up last Tuesday, a stranger offering a lump sum to buy that lease out forever, with no way to know if the number is fair because nobody ever told him what his tower is worth. The paradox. American Tower and SBA Communications pulled in more than $13 billion combined last year, while landowners hosting the actual towers collected somewhere between $600 and $2,500 a month. Same industry, 2 very different sets of numbers. This breakdown answers why the steel pole itself is worth almost nothing to the people who get rich here, and the answer has almost nothing to do with the tower itself. A cell tower is not one business, it is 3, and almost everyone who dreams about owning a cell tower is only picturing one of them. The first door is the ground lease, the agreement where you rent your own land to whoever wants to put a tower on it. This is the landowner's door, the one behind almost every fantasy about tower ownership, and it is a real business, just a much smaller one than people assume. The second door is the tower company itself. Instead of owning the ground, you own the structure. You build or buy the actual pole, the foundation, the lighting, the fencing, and then you lease space on it to multiple wireless carriers at once, collecting several rent checks off one piece of steel. This is the door American Tower, Crown Castle, and SBA Communications walked through decades ago, and it is the door this breakdown follows, because it is the only one of the 3 where the fantasy and the real economics come anywhere close to matching. The third door is stranger, and most people never hear about it until a letter shows up in their mailbox, buying out other people's ground leases. Specialized firms pay landowners a lump sum, once, in exchange for decades of future rent, and then either collect that rent themselves or bundle it and resell it, which we will get to later, because that is where an enormous amount of the real money in this industry hides. One of the 3 companies that walked through that second door, the tower company door, spent a recent 18-month stretch churning through 4 different chief executives, and the reason why is a story worth sitting with, because it shows exactly what happens when a company forgets which of these 3 doors it is supposed to be standing in. 3 doors: a landowner renting dirt, a tower company renting steel, and a buyout firm renting time itself. This breakdown follows the second door, the tower company, because that is the version of owning a cell tower that resembles what the postcard promised. So how much does it actually cost to buy your way into this fantasy? Building a cell tower from scratch is not a weekend project, and the price of admission comes in layers most people never see coming until they are already committed. First, the land. You need either to buy a small parcel outright or secure a long-term ground lease of your own, and in dense or high-demand markets, that negotiation alone can take months because you are competing with every other operator who wants the same sliver of elevation on the same ridge or the same highway interchange. Second, the federal paperwork. Before a single support beam goes up, the site has to clear a Federal Communications Commission environmental review under the National Environmental Policy Act, sometimes called a NEPA review, plus a historic preservation review in some cases, a process the FCC itself proposed to streamline in August of 2025, because even the regulator admits it has become a bottleneck. Local zoning and permitting stack on top of the federal review, and between application fees, engineering studies, and legal costs, that stage alone typically runs somewhere between $15,000 and $40,000 per site, with approval timelines stretching anywhere from several months to well over a year. Third, the structure itself. A galvanized steel monopole or lattice tower, its foundation, the fencing, the lighting required if the structure is tall enough to pose a hazard to aircraft, and the physical build-out of equipment shelters for each carrier that eventually leases space, the entire package lands, on average, somewhere around $250,000 for a typical American site, inside a broader national range of $200,000 to $300,000. Now scale that. A single tower is a rounding error. American Tower alone operates close to 150,000 communications sites worldwide, and SBA Communications runs more than 46,000. Reaching that scale from a standing start would mean writing that $250,000 check tens of thousands of times, which is precisely why almost nobody enters this industry by building. They enter by buying, acquiring smaller independent tower portfolios that already have carriers signed and paying, which sidesteps the permitting bottleneck entirely but replaces it with a different problem: paying a premium for cash flow that already exists instead of a discount for cash flow you have to create yourself. Here's the trap. Almost every cost that actually erodes a tower's profit shows up after the ribbon cutting, not before it. Start with insurance and liability. A structure tall enough to require Federal Aviation Administration lighting compliance is also tall enough to be genuinely dangerous, both to the public below and to the people who service it. Wireless construction crews were dying at a rate of 10.8 per 100,000 workers in 2021 and 8.3 per 100,000 in 2022. And while that is actually lower than trades like structural ironwork, which ran 36.1 per 100,000 the same year, it is high enough that liability coverage, safety compliance, and specialized maintenance contracts are a permanent, non-negotiable line item, not an occasional one. Then there is the escalator clause, the contracted annual rent increase, working against the tower company instead of for it. The same mechanism that quietly compounds a landowner's ground rent over 25 years is, from the tower operator's side, a cost that climbs every single year whether or not a new carrier ever shows up to help cover it. Add structural inspections, tower lighting maintenance, ground equipment repairs, and the periodic re-permitting that comes with any structural modification, and a tower that looked like pure margin on the spreadsheet starts looking like a slow leak instead. Here's where it gets dangerous for anyone who financed the build: tenant churn. The entire economics of the tower company door depend on stacking multiple carriers on one structure, and if even one of those carriers merges, exits a market, or renegotiates downward, the fixed costs of the tower do not shrink to match. The rent goes down. The insurance, the maintenance, the ground lease escalator, and the debt service do not. And underneath all of it sits the federal paperwork trap. Modifying an existing tower, adding a new tenant's equipment, or even changing an antenna's height can trigger a fresh round of FCC and local review, the exact bottleneck the industry spent years lobbying to streamline. Owning the steel was never the hard part. Keeping it fully rented, fully compliant, and fully insured, year after year after year, is the part nobody puts on the postcard. Here's where it gets interesting. The money does not arrive all at once. It arrives in layers, and most people only ever picture the first one. Layer 1 is the ground rent. If you are standing in the landowner's door, this is the entire business, somewhere between $500 and $1,000 a month for a rural or highway site, $800 to $1,500 for something suburban or commercial, and up into the $1,200 to $2,500 range or higher for dense urban ground sites, with rooftop macro locations sometimes reaching $3,500 a month. Layer 2 is where the tower company door starts to separate from the landowner's door. The anchor tenant lease, the first carrier that signs on to the tower, paying rent that covers most or all of the tower company's own ground lease and fixed costs, but rarely much more than that on its own. Layer 3 is where the business actually starts to work: co-location, meaning every additional carrier that leases space on the same structure. Adding a second or third tenant to a tower that is already standing, already permitted, already generating its baseline rent costs the tower company almost nothing in new capital, no new land, no new foundation, no new federal review in most cases, while adding a full, fresh rent check on top of the first. This is the single mechanical reason the tower company door outperforms the landowner's door by an order of magnitude, and it is worth sitting with because it is also the reason this entire industry consolidated into 3 giant public companies, instead of staying a hobby for thousands of small landowners. Layer 4 is the escalator itself, compounding quietly in the background, a contracted 2 to 3% annual increase across potentially 25 to 30 years of renewal options, which sounds small until you run the math on decades of compounding across tens of thousands of towers simultaneously. And layer 5, sitting underneath all of it, and rarely discussed outside the industry, is the buyout and resale market. Specialized firms paying landowners a lump sum equal to roughly 15 to 19 times their current annual rent, in exchange for owning that rent stream, with all its escalators, for decades to come. Stack those 5 layers on top of a company the size of American Tower, which closed its most recent full year with revenue of $10.6 billion and adjusted funds from operations, a cash profit metric the industry calls AFO, of just over $5 billion, or SBA Communications, which converted nearly half of its $2.8 billion in revenue into distributable cash, and the picture looks less like rent collection and more like an extremely well-engineered cash machine. So far, owning a cell tower sounds like a business that prints money on a schedule, as predictable as a mortgage payment. Now here is the other side of the ledger. Here's the part nobody tells you. The tower is not really a telecommunications asset. It behaves like one, it looks like one, 3 carriers' antennas are bolted to it, and it undeniably carries phone calls. But strip away the wireless jargon, and what American Tower, Crown Castle, and SBA Communications actually operate is a real estate holding company that happens to rent space to phone companies instead of retailers. Real estate companies structure themselves as real estate investment trusts, or REITs, for a specific legal reason. A REIT is not taxed at the corporate level the way an ordinary company is, as long as it distributes at least 90% of its taxable income to shareholders every year. All 3 of the dominant tower companies are organized this way. That single structural choice is worth more to the people who actually get rich in this industry than any single tower, any single lease, any single carrier contract, because it means the entire cash-generating machine described a moment ago, the ground rent, the anchor tenant, the co-location layers, the compounding escalators, passes through to the owners of the company with one major layer of taxation removed entirely. That is the real money room. But it is not the deepest layer, because it still assumes you already own the tower company. The deepest layer belongs to the buyout firms, and here is the part that should make you uncomfortable. When a specialized firm offers a landowner 15 to 19 times their current annual rent as a lump sum, that number sounds enormous to someone collecting $900 a month. It is not enormous, it is a discount. A landowner with a 25-year lease and a 2% annual escalator is sitting on a stream of payments that, run through even a conservative present value calculation, is worth meaningfully more than 19 years of today's rent, and the buyout firm knows exactly how much more, because valuing decades of compounding cash flow against a lump sum is the entire job. The landowner is trading a number they can understand for a number the buyer understands better. That gap, repeated across tens of thousands of properties, is where a genuinely enormous amount of the real money in this industry has been quietly hiding the entire time. Read that arithmetic again, then attach a name to it. Crown Castle did not start as a cautionary tale. It started, like American Tower and SBA Communications, as a straightforward tower company. And by the early 2010s, it had become one of the 3 dominant players in American wireless infrastructure. Then, in 2012, Crown Castle acquired a company called NextG Networks for approximately $1 billion and used it as the seed of an entirely new business line. Small cells and fiber, the low-power street-level nodes and underground cable networks that carriers were beginning to need in dense cities where a traditional macro tower could not physically fit. For most of the 2010s, this looked like foresight. Crown Castle poured billions into building out that fiber and small cell business, betting it would become the company's next major growth engine as wireless demand kept climbing in exactly the places macro towers could not reach. At its peak, industry coverage described the segment as a $15 billion business, a genuine empire built entirely on the bet that owning the cable, not just the tower, was the future. Then came the decline. Starting in 2020, the activist investment firm Elliott Investment Management began quietly pushing Crown Castle to abandon the fiber strategy entirely and refocus purely on towers, eventually building a stake reported at roughly $1 billion to force the issue. The pressure became visible chaos. In an 18-month stretch, Crown Castle burned through 4 different chief executives, from Jay Brown to Stephen Moskowitz, who was terminated in March of 2025, through an interim leader before finally landing on Christian Hillebrandt in September of that year. The death came in 2026 when Crown Castle sold the entire fiber and small cell segment for $8.5 billion combined, split between two buyers, netting roughly $8.4 billion after costs. Run that number next to the $15 billion the business was reportedly worth under review, and the arithmetic tells its own story. The afterlife is what remains, a leaner Crown Castle, refocused entirely on its original roughly 40,000 towers. Its dividend cut nearly a third, from $6.26 to $4.25 annually, in exchange for finally becoming what activists had wanted the entire time, a pure-play tower REIT. Crown Castle's fiber empire was appraised, at its peak, at $15 billion. It sold for roughly $8.5. The gap between those two numbers is what happens when a company forgets which door it originally walked through. Why does the steel itself matter so little to the people who actually get rich here? Because the people who get rich are not really in the tower business. They are in the consolidation business, wrapped in a tax structure, applied at a scale no individual landowner can ever reach alone. Remember co-location, the mechanic from a few sections back, where a second or third tenant adds almost pure margin to a tower that is already standing? That mechanic only compounds into real wealth when you own thousands of towers simultaneously, because the math of near-zero marginal cost only becomes enormous money once it is multiplied across a portfolio, not a single pole in a field. That is exactly what happened to this industry over the last 2 decades. The three dominant companies did not get big by each landowner deciding to expand. They got big by buying up smaller independent tower operators one portfolio at a time, until, combined, the top companies came to control just under 70% of every privately owned tower site in the country. Every acquisition adds co-location-ready inventory instantly, without the permitting slog described earlier. Layer the REIT tax status on top of that consolidated portfolio, and the 90% income distribution requirement stops looking like a constraint and starts looking like the entire point. It turns a real estate roll-up into a legally tax-advantaged cash distribution machine, one that can keep buying the next portfolio using the very cash flow the tax structure protected. The landowner in rural Ohio was never going to outcompete that. He owns one tower. The math that makes this industry genuinely lucrative requires owning tens of thousands of them, tax-shielded, at once. Owning a tower was never really the business. Owning the tax status, the scale, and the paperwork that lets you consolidate faster than anyone else. That was always the business underneath the business. A savings account pays more than some of these towers do in a bad year. Picture a small independent operator who owns 25 towers scattered across a mid-sized state, each one built for roughly $250,000, each one carrying an anchor tenant and, ideally, at least one co-location partner. In a good year, every anchor lease renews on schedule, the 2% escalators land without a fight, and 3 additional carriers sign co-location agreements across the portfolio at an average of $1,500 a month each, adding new revenue that costs almost nothing in new capital because the towers, the land, and the permits already exist. Added up, escalator growth, 3 new co-location contracts, and stable occupancy across 25 sites, and that operator is looking at close to $600,000 in incremental annual revenue on top of a base that was already comfortably profitable. Great year. In a bad year, one regional carrier merger eliminates a tenant on 4 of the 25 towers, 2 co-location prospects that were mid-negotiation walk away entirely, and a structural inspection turns up lighting and foundation repairs across 6 sites that were not budgeted for, at somewhere between $20,000 and $50,000 per site. Rough year. Run the numbers, and the swing between those 2 versions of the same 25-tower portfolio, in the same year, under the same ownership, is not a rounding error. It is the difference between $600,000 in new revenue and roughly $300,000 in unplanned losses and lost rent. A swing of the better part of $1 million on paper assets that never moved an inch and never stopped standing exactly where they were built. The steel does not care which year it is. The paperwork, the tenants, and the timing decide everything. Picture that quarter acre one more time, the fenced patch of grass, the monopole rising out of it, the antennas bolted near the top, the small shelter humming quietly at the base. It still looks, from the road, exactly like the postcard promised. Simple, sturdy, collecting rent while you sleep. It was never really the tower. The tower was the bait, the visible, understandable, dinner party-ready version of a business, whose actual engine is consolidation, tax structure, and the patient arithmetic of decades compounding against people who never got to see the math.